scour the skies. What the shadows they cast draw the spirits near. After all, tomorrow.
You live there, Chris?
Christopher is muted.
It's not letting him unmute. No good. Somebody's finally got him to shut up.
Guys. You don't want
Well.
Christopher.
That is interesting, ladies and gentlemen. We are joined tonight by Bishop Bryan himself, and I'm really thank you very much again for coming on the show tonight. Weird things are definitely happening tonight on the show, guys. That I have never seen in my entire life before. It was playing the trailer, but I couldn't see it.
We've had that happen a couple times before.
I think Bishop Bryan's maybe experienced that. But never to this extent. I mean, I've checked my internet. I'm running about 120 meg per second. It should be fine. It's very strange. So I would like to thank Bishop Bryan for coming on the show. I'm joined tonight by my co-host Dakota and my co-host Drew tonight. It's going to be a fantastic interview tonight. So I would like to thank everybody in the chat. I'm feared to press any buttons now in case it explodes or something. It's thank you everybody for coming in. Welcome, Bishop Bryan, all the way from whereabouts are you in the United States?
Willette. It's think of the Ouija board. So the French word for yes, O-U-I. When you have that O-U before a vowel in French, you get the W sound. So it's Willette.
Oh, yeah. Interesting.
Yeah. But thank you. I appreciate being invited on, and happy to be here.
I would like Bishop. Well, strange things are happening. As I say, there's a lot of weird interference we're getting tonight. Drew, are you experiencing anything weird tonight?
Not really, no, not so far. Touch wood. A little delay.
I don't know what it is. I could cut the energy with a knife. That's what it's like. I've got my cross on. I feel like an exorcist film now. But I would like to ask you, Bishop Bryan, a question that I've always wanted to ask you, because I do watch your lives quite regular. How did you get into this? Can you tell us a little bit about yourself and how you actually go into this position you're in right now?
Sure. It was really not something I intended to do. I was operating the church. I was asked to be, or I guess you could say, elevated to the position of the chief administrator for the Holy Nicolean Catholic Church in its foundation years. And we were a teaching ministry on basically Christian esotericism. That was our primary focus. And being an independent Catholic ministry, not operating under the authority of Rome, but being affiliated, and then eventually we joined in union with the old Catholics, kind of getting back to the roots of independent Catholicism. We didn't really have any of the restrictions that Roman Catholic parishes tend to have, or any Roman Catholic diocese, where if a person comes to a Roman Catholic church with a type of paranormal or spiritual problem, or something they feel might be a demonic attachment, they might not get a whole lot of help from the Roman Catholic diocese unless they're an established member. Then there's a lot of research that goes into it, a lot of approvals that need to be made, a lot of red tape that you have to cut through to be able to get any help. So a lot of people in our area were having this happen to them, and the Archdiocese of Atlanta was not either able to provide help or were unwilling to provide help. And so they started searching for independent Catholics or other Catholic churches, or calling different Catholic churches, and they called us. And I don't have such restrictions on me. So if a person comes to me for spiritual help, I go help them. And that's how it got started. And I guess word got out. And before long, we started having more people coming to us than we could possibly service, because we're very small and terribly underfunded most of the time. So, we only have so many resources. But that's how it got started. It was never intended. This church was not set up for that. But I was just fulfilling my obligation as a Catholic priest or a Catholic minister, to be able to help people that come to you for help. And, if they need spiritual assistance, you provide it. And that's what we were doing.
It's actually something I've always wanted to ask. How do you determine if that person's telling the truth, as they've got like a demonic possession or no? Because they could have like mental problems. They could have like problems in their head. They might think there might be schizophrenic. They might think. How do you come to that conclusion that they have a real demonic attachment?
Well, if it gets to the point where we have to start considering exorcism, if we're dealing with a case that's severe enough where it might require that, we get an evaluation, a professional evaluation from a psychologist and a medical doctor to be able to determine whether or not there's anything else going on there. So in order to perform an exorcism, the person has to be in fairly decent health. A doctor has to write off on that. And there has to be generally no history there that would indicate that this could be coming from some other more mundane source. If that checks out, if the doctor says I can't find anything wrong with them, if the psychologist says, they seem fine to me, or, it's nothing that would be a psychotic disorder or something of that nature, then we start taking the spiritual more seriously, or because now we're dealing with no other explanation except for what they are encountering. And if it's not psychosis, if it's not neurological, then the spiritual tends to be the last possibility. Yeah. Of course, esoterically speaking, metaphysically speaking, it all kind of interplays together anyway, because nobody can have a genuine demonic attachment without there being psychological and emotional consequences, sometimes even physiological consequences. They always go together. And the other way around, if you are vulnerable physically or mentally or emotionally, you are far more at risk for developing an attachment. So they kind of go together. And that's the hard part. The hard part's not really determining whether or not it's genuine. It's sometimes hard to determine which is the cause, because they always present together, and most people that we've dealt with have all three. So they have a genuine, if it's a genuine case, they have a genuine demonic attachment, they have psychological consequences, and they are also dealing with physiological issues too. But the one thing that tends to be pervasive is that their doctors don't know what to do about it. They've tried the normal treatments, they don't work, but prayer does. So these are the things that we do in order to try to, isolate the issue and help them. But honestly, a holistic approach is really how you handle this. So the most ideal thing is to have everybody working together. So, if the doctor's willing to work with us, that's a huge asset for the victim. If a psychologist is willing to work with us, that's great too. And sometimes we even get referred clients from psychiatrists or psychologists in the area, because they're seeing stuff that does not present as normal mental illness, and they're disturbed by it. And some of these people are not Christian, so you can't say it's just like they're super religious and they're sort of projecting their beliefs into their clients, some kind of transference. It's not really that. We've had very logical, very, respected doctors and psychologists come to us for help.
Yeah. Dakota, would you like to?
No, just kind of add on the psychological issues. One thing I've noticed in my research is that with everything that's been going on with the last few years, that a lot of reports of alleged, we'll use that word just for the sake of it, demonic activity seemed to have almost skyrocketed a bit, being with COVID restrictions, concerns of domestic violence victims. Have you noticed that yourself?
Oh yeah, oh absolutely. That is something that definitely started to exponentially increase around the time of COVID, to the point that I've always felt that COVID had a spiritual dimension to it. That it wasn't just what we would see it as, some kind of pandemic that occurred, but that there was something nefarious going on with the entire thing. What that is, I couldn't tell you. I can speculate, but there was definitely a correlation between what happened with COVID and an increase in demonic activity. But really, the increase, I think, in general terms, even taking COVID out of the equation for a minute and just looking at the last 20 or 30 years and seeing an increase, I think it has more to do with people just becoming less and less spiritually protected. As we get more secularized as a society, we start taking spirituality less seriously. And when you, I guess, relegate it down to where it's just superstition, then how is a person prepared to deal with the genuine article when it happens? They're not. And if you don't have a support system from your church, or you don't have a priest or a pastor you can go to for help, and you don't know who to turn to that will believe you, and society's telling you it's all in your head, that's a terrible mix of problems for a person that's dealing with this genuinely to have to figure out. So I really think it has to do with a lack of spiritual protection, which is ultimately the result of religious and spiritual apathy. People just don't care about church and religion anymore. They don't care about their spiritualities. Or if they do care about spirituality, they do it in a very relaxed sort of, it's my own thing. They'll meditate or something. They'll do some trivial stuff, but nothing formal, nothing that has the power of history behind it. It's just, dabbling at home with meditation to relax or something like that. But developing a relationship with God, that's challenging for people today to try to figure out. So that's what I think's going on with that.
Oh, fair.
Yeah, definitely. People are starting to search
Drew, would you like
further
to
afield for their spirituality as well, aren't they?
I'm sorry, you broke up a little bit on that one. I didn't hear you. I'm sorry.
Yeah, hear the echo. People are, instead of searching in your local towns now as well for a local church or a pastor or something, a lot of people are taking to online to find their religion and things. I've noticed a lot in the past 5-10 years. There's a lot of online churches and things as well, and spiritual temples and things.
That is true. And that's why our presence as an independent church is mostly online. And interestingly, a lot of our congregation is international. So, we find that we had a public location for a few years, and that was costly. It was a lot of overhead for the church to have to pay. But we're larger now, streaming our services online and building an online community where people from all over the world can now participate and be a part of what we do. And they're getting a lot out of it. The downside is Catholicism sort of requires physical contact for certain things like sacraments. So there's no replacement for receiving the Eucharist at Mass. I can't give you that over the computer, or I can't do that over the YouTube. But at least people are getting some kind of spiritual connection and fellowship. And you're right. So people are turning to online. And I think part of it has to do with it feels safer. Maybe people are becoming more introverted because of computers, I think, and getting themselves out there, putting themselves at risk, being part of a community that they feel may or may not accept them, is intimidating to a lot of people, particularly younger people who don't know what to do or have never been brought to church by their parents, and they're really unsure as to how to behave or what to expect. So I
It's
think
always a
watching
set
online.
well in the small towns of Christianity.
Yes.
Yeah, it's always like a Christianity or
I've
a
al-
Scottish
it's
church
it's
or an
something
English
that I've
church. But
noticed that
online, you get education.
Yes, that's true. That's true. I'm sorry. What were you saying, Christopher? There seems to be like almost like a 30-second delay sometimes.
I was just I was I,
Yeah,
there's weird. It's weird. I think it's crossing the Atlantic. It's amazing technology, but sometimes it just goes wrong.
Yeah.
It's quite interesting you say about how churches are closing down there, because I'm in a little mining community, and at one
Mhm.
time we had 3 churches. Now we've got 1, and we're lucky if
Wow.
there's got 4 or 5 people go to it.
Yeah.
And
Now it's
I've
worse in
noticed there's a
Europe.
lot of churches near me and all the towns round about me that are just closing. They're closing.
Yeah.
They're actually, people are turning these places into houses. And what's
And
your thoughts on
bars
that?
and
That's a good question, actually. What is your thoughts in turning a beautiful church into a house?
I know it's sad to see, and it happens here too. Not as much as what's happening in Europe. I think Europe's a little bit ahead of us. There's still a large Christian community here of active Christians, but they're not necessarily Catholic. When you see a lot of evangelical churches, they're very popular. They very well funded. In the United States, I don't know what they call them in Europe, if you even have such a thing, but here they call them mega churches, and they're more like concerts. You're not really going there to pray as much as you're going there to listen to like Christian rock bands. And I don't see the spiritual value in that, but a lot of people apparently do. But I don't think it necessarily protects you against these kinds of things. So there's risk there. It could be a false safety that those kinds of churches produce. And the biggest thing that we're encountering on a regular basis is that people are contacting their pastor and asking them, I'm having this kind of paranormal issue. Can you come help? And they'll come out and they'll do a blessing or something, and it doesn't work. And so we're usually like the 3rd or 4th person they call, because they do actually go, if they have a church, they try to go through their church, and their church doesn't really know what to do. And for those churches that try, they're not successful. So that tells me that the entire methodology is wrong. They don't understand what they're doing. They're just winging it. They're seeing it as, if I pray to God, God will hear me. Well, it doesn't quite work that smoothly. Dealing with the demonic is a lot more complicated than that. I wish it was as simple as a simple prayer and then it just goes away. It doesn't work like that.
That's actually something that I would really like to get into, is the demonic. I mean, what would you say is the worst case you've ever done?
Well, I would say equally any genuine full-scale possession. So when you have somebody that is in full-blown possession, full integration, we call it. It's when the demonic presence has fully integrated into the consciousness of the victim. Those are always equally the worst. I can't say one's worse than another, because once it gets to that point, if it gets to that point, which is thankfully quite rare, but when you see it, you know it, and it's horrible. And it's really more of an empathy thing, because you see this person in pain and suffering, and there's only so much you can do. Even as the exorcist, to alleviate their suffering through it. You have to basically just stand your ground and work to break the attachment and rid this from their life. But you see the suffering every step of the way, and it can sometimes take weeks or even months or years to fully break such an attachment that would lead to full possession. So they're all bad. When you encounter it, it's quite sad to see.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Dakota?
No, as someone who's actually,
Dakota, would you like
If
to ask
my-
a question?
if my signal will let me, as I started talking, right, I started hearing everybody break up. It's like, oh, lovely.
Yeah.
It's like, not as someone who's unfortunately had to
Yeah.
be involved in certain ceremonies, I can certainly attest that it's horrible. I've seen people go as far as moving across country and taking their own life to just try to get away from it. They were that bothered, especially when young children start to get targeted.
And that has happened, anybody's at risk. I think sometimes there's also a false illusion that people feel that if they are Christian, if they're baptized, then it can't touch them. But that's not true. Anybody is potentially at risk, but there are things that you can do to mitigate that risk. And in my experience, and I don't say this just because I am biased, and it's really not a bias that I hold. It's really just through observation that I've noticed that those that have a solid foundation, a relationship with God, a healthy view of the world, they're internally happy with themselves. They're content with their lives. They don't try to expect too much. They live peacefully. They don't try to, they're not aggressive people. They're not angry people. These are the people that are least at risk. It could still, in theory, happen to them, but it's not likely. What I see is that when you combine spiritual apathy or religious apathy with a type of emotional or psychological vulnerability, those are the targets. Those are the best targets. And I think the demonic likes to work with people who are mentally ill because it can hide behind the appearance of the illness. And it can be almost completely invisible, because if you can target a schizophrenic, and it's always everything that we see is always going to look like the psychosis. It's not going to look like anything spiritual,
Yeah.
And then it becomes an ethical issue whether or not you perform an exorcism on someone that's diagnosed with schizophrenia. That can be ethically problematic. So it's a wonderful target, because you could hide there in a person with that type of issue for the rest of that person's life, and they might never get the help that they need.
Yeah. Sad. Do you find that there's a perfect storm for a possession,
Okay,
such as arbitrary kids and things?
Yeah, I mean, I think it has to do with spiritual apathy, which can be different things. I mean, different things. It could mean something as simple as just not caring enough to pursue a relationship with God, not caring enough to try to figure out whether or not faith is something for you, or just going through the secular motions where you're like, I don't really need that in my life. That's a simple, common type of apathy. But spiritual apathy can also mean being licentious. Being a person that commits a lot of sin because they enjoy whatever their sinful, pleasures are, and that weakens them morally and on a deeper spiritual level. And they're also, I would say a person that has a I don't want to say obsession, but a person that has, I guess, an addiction to a particular type of sinful behavior and is not doing anything to correct that, that is a perfect storm. That is a perfect recipe for this kind of thing that we see. But understand, I've also seen, almost saintly-like people develop a demonic attachment.
Right.
And that can happen too. Sometimes I think it has to do with strengthening one's own resolve, and that God puts us into these situations where we might have to find out what we're all about, inside. And it's
you to strengthen your faith and things.
Yes, exactly. And I think it does. It can. It can teach you that you need to strengthen your faith.
Yeah.
We've actually got a question in the chat. Can you explain the difference between a demon and demonic entities?
Yes, that's actually a really good question, because I've developed a model that I work with in our organization that helps to sort of identify and break these things down in a way that services solutions for each particular kind of problem. So in this work, I've reduced demonic activity down to 4 types of appearances. So one would be your classic demonic, fallen angel. So this is like the Judeo-Christian classic demon. Okay. They're very difficult to work with. Yeah. They're extremely intelligent, and they are very manipulative. So if a person is being possessed by something of that nature, it can be very hard to liberate them from it. It can take a very long time to be successful in being able to resolve that. But that's, in my mind, a classic demon, at least in the Judeo-Christian worldview. You could call it an evil spirit, but it's a lot more than that. Then the next one the next 3 are really not demons at all, but we can call them demons because they still have negative effects on the victims that are, dealing with an attachment to whatever one they might be. So the second kind is what we call elementals. Now, these can be primordial incorporeal creatures. In fact, there's no physicality to them, or very limited physicality. So they're mostly non-corporeal. However, they have been here for longer than we have in terms of, the earth. And a lot of times these things are wired to a type of spiritual frequency that is not compatible with our own, and that can make us spiritually sick. So it's 2 frequencies that are not compatible coming into contact with each other can create a type of demonic experience for the victim, because the elemental just wants that person out of that location or whatever they might have claimed for themselves, and is attacking that person in no more of an intelligent way than a mosquito might be feeding off of you for your blood. It's not malicious. A mosquito doesn't bite you because it wants to be mean to you. It's its nature. And so you've got elementals that will feed on our energy. You've got elementals that will attack us because they're territorial and want us away. Maybe a house was built on land that they have inhabited, and when people move in, the problems begin. But there's a large range of these. You could have very simple ones like spiritual mosquitoes, and you could have very sophisticated ones like jinn. So it really matters as to the level that you're dealing with. But for the victim, it's going to feel like a demon. Is it a fallen angel? No. Is it satanic? No. So not all demons are satanic in the religious sense. The third one is the most common that we see, and that is what we call created. And this is a very occult concept of thought forms. Buddhists call them tulpas. If many people are being affected, it can be referred to as an egregore. But essentially what it is a thought form. We can create these out of our own trauma, and that will actually become a physical sentient experience that will haunt the person. So let me give you an example of how this works. Let's say, you have a child who's been brutally abused for their entire childhood, sexually, every way possible. And then now they grow up into adulthood and they're carrying all of this trauma, that can go one of 2 ways. For the most usual way is to repress it. So repression becomes a psychological issue that needs to be dealt with in therapy, sometimes with medication. to kind of get over some of the manifestations of repression, which can be anxiety, depression, and everything else. Personality disorders are typical as well in these kinds of cases. But what happens if you're the kind of person that doesn't repress it internally but projects it outward? Psychology has no framework for working with such a person, but the occult always has. And that is exactly what this is that the way that certain kinds of people, a smaller number of the population, deals with that internal trauma is to move it out instead of repressing it further inside so they don't have to deal with it or think about it or feel it. They project it outward so they don't have to think about it, experience it, or feel it. And that becomes literally a entity that builds off of the energy of that trauma and now becomes this external sentience that attacks them. That is the single most common type of demonic or evil spirit that we see as something that they themselves created accidentally, because you don't really need a ritual to create a thought form. It's part of our nature as a creature of creation to be able to do this. But it can also be an occult practitioner that does this. So when you hear about generational curses, or you hear about people that were attacked by, somebody went to a sorcerer to have a ritual done to attack their enemy, and the enemy creates like a servitor and sends it to that target, that's still a thought form that becomes a demonic attachment for that victim. And all of these are dealt with differently. The solutions for this is all done differently. You can't just start waving, crucifixes around, saying the rites of exorcism and splashing holy water and expect that it's always going to work for each one of these cases. You have to know what you're dealing with first. And then the last kind is what we call wrathful spirits. And these are the dead that did not die well. Okay, so they were not able to deal with either their death themselves, they weren't ready for it, or the death was itself traumatic, be it murder or an accident that was unexpected, driving to work, you're on top of the world, everything's great, and then somebody cuts you off and you lose control of your vehicle and now you're dead. Could happen to any one of us, but that shock of not prepared for it, not expecting it, can be enough trauma where the person doesn't know what to do, doesn't even know they're dead, and they stay behind in this spiritual state. The spirit is no longer able to rationalize because it doesn't have the brain to help to process the experience. So all that's left is just instinct. So if the last thought is fear, then fear is what they become. If the last thought is anger, then anger is what they become. And this becomes now a evil spirit to the rest of us. And that is another major thing. So malevolent hauntings are almost always related somehow to that. All of them will feel like demons, though, to people. So if you're a Christian who doesn't want to believe in ghosts, you're just going to see demons everywhere. The reality is fallen angels are not that prolific. It's really special circumstances where we might ever come in contact with a fallen angel. So most of the time it's going to be elemental, created thought form, or a wrathful spirit. And just because grandpa, was a good guy in life doesn't mean his spirit hanging around you is a good thing for you. Well, spiritual degradation is what happens. So the spirit, and this is where it gets metaphysical, but the spirit decomposes just like the body decomposes. Really all that's left is the soul. It's a completely different thing. We don't tend to distinguish the difference between souls and spirits, but they're different things. The soul has an eternal quality, and that always returns back to the source. As a Christian, we call that God. But it doesn't really belong to you. You only get to keep it. Salvation, in the Christian sense, salvation is when you get to keep it. You get it, it's yours now. But the body and the spirit, they just decompose, and the spirit decomposes at a different rate than the body. So what you see as a ghost is a spirit that no longer has the body to rationalize and doesn't have the soul to guide it, and all that's left is this residual energy that's not good. So if a person sticks around too long because there's so much sadness at their death, that's not healthy. In fact, that's why I'm very much against the way we do funerals, because they're little pity parties for the living, and it just creates the seed for attachment. There's sadness, there's loss, and you need to deal with those feelings, but we need to do them in the proper spiritual context. That's why the rites of Christian burial.
In America.
I'm sorry, what was that?
Do you have humanists in America that lead funerals? Over here, instead of a priest or a minister and things, we have a humanist who kind of goes up and celebrates your life. They'll say things like, this person was a great artist or something. So they kind of celebrate your life instead of going through the old funeral rites, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, no, I mean, that is definitely an option. I don't think it's common, but it is an option. And some people do take that approach to be, let's celebrate the person's life instead of being sad about their loss. But ultimately, the attachments must be broken no matter which approach you're doing it, because attachment is not just some spirit attaching to you. It can be your spirit as a living person attaching to something that's dead. So we always, I think it's the reverse. We always think that, oh, I got an attachment. Something latched on to me. I went on this ghost hunt and I brought something back. But we forget that our spirit is the same substance as everything else, and it can attach to other things while we're alive. And if let's say you're a parent, God forbid you lose your child, I can tell you right now, those parents are going to have an unhealthy attachment towards that deceased child. And that can be a mutually destructive spiritual event when that happens, because if you don't know how to break attachment, then you're going to get lost in that attachment.
Yeah, that bereavement will kill you.
Yeah, it will.
So say we've got somebody that believes that they've got an attachment. How do you get rid of that attachment that's on them?
That's where you have to know exactly what kind of attachment it is. That's where these categories become essential. So you need to know if it's a fallen angel. Now you're going to have to get very aggressive with the rites of the church, because only the rites of the church can actually help that. And simple prayer is not going to make a difference. It can empower you, but the church has the rite of exorcism for a reason. It didn't just this isn't like a carryover from ancient times that, is no longer necessary and largely superfluous in our modern society. No, the reason the church still has it is because it works. And the older rites are even better than the ones that they have now, where they've kind of softened the language and it doesn't work as well as it used to. So we use the old rites in our church, in our ministry. So that's the only way to get rid of a fallen angel, is to be able to utilize the rites of exorcism and to go through that lengthy process. But everything else could go in many different directions. Elementals could be simply a matter of making a deal. Making an arrangement. A wrathful spirit can just be as simple as inviting them to mass and then offering them prayers so that they can move on and cross over. Most of the time, that's all you got to do with a wrathful spirit is cross them over. So even psychics can do this. A really good psychic that has that natural talent, they can do it. You don't even need to be a priest. I mean, there's anybody can offer prayers for the dead. That's another thing that spiritual apathy has done to this world. We don't pray for the dead anymore. And that creates a lot of problems, and not even all Christian churches think you need to. It's like basically just the Catholics and the Orthodox do that. Protestants don't, evangelicals don't. They're taught that they don't need to do that. Yeah, you do need to do that. They need our prayers. They're part of the church too, and we need to help them. So there's that. And as far as the hard ones, that can be challenging is the created, because thought forms need to be sort of disassembled energetically. So you're literally breaking down, wearing down the energy that was created, and that almost always requires a knowledge of the attachment point, which is usually the trauma. And if the trauma goes unresolved, then the attachment remains. So that's when you have to combine. It's essential to combine the spiritual work with the psychological. They need to go to therapy. They need to learn to deal with that trauma, come to terms with that trauma, and release it. Because it's all about releasing attachment. And this is why Buddhists are naturally inclined towards this, because the entire philosophy of Buddhism is about non-attachment. I mean, the way of life is non-attachment. And this is how they're able to exercise not just evil spirits from their lives, but all the unhealthy things that we pick up as living beings, and we put value into stuff that is impermanent and just causes pain and sorrow in the end. And that's true for the Buddhist, the Christian, or anybody. Having a good spiritual foundation is essential.
Yeah, I believe that.
Yeah.
Dakota, would you like to ask a question, Dakota? There?
Actually, yes. A few months back, we had Barry Fitzgerald on to talk about his book, The Deception of Gods and Men. It mostly focuses on the UFO phenomenon, but I've noticed there can be some overlap. One of the things he points out with certain abduction scenarios, and it's something that a lot of people have associated with demonics, just because they don't know what else to call it, yeah. Is that, say, like someone may actually be more prone to these types of events, let's call them, if they're anemic. Say, a woman who's on her menstrual cycle, or just someone who doesn't get a lot of iron in their blood. What would be your thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, certainly, like I said, all of the paranormal is holistic in nature. So just because we might have a physiological situation that predisposes us to some type of experience that feels paranormal, but a doctor might say, oh no, it's being caused by this, doesn't mean that there's not a relationship to both. We are the entirety of our experience. We're not just one part of that experience. So the physical world is made up of our physiology, but as well as our emotional and psychological well-being, and that spiritual center, that all that incorporeal part of our nature, which deals with thought and feeling, but also, the soul. And the environment itself is a reflection of that too. So the external world around us, our domicile, is also very much dependent upon this. So yes, there's different times in our lives where certain physiological conditions can predispose us to being more receptive to spiritual energy, be it for good or evil. I mean, it can go either way depending upon what you're dealing with. As far as like UFOs, I know it's a big thing here in the U.S. For Christians to write them off as a demonic deception. I do not subscribe to that belief. I'm not sure what UFOs might be. They seem to be pretty elusive. I find it interesting that the governments of the world now are getting more vocal about it, and they're no longer just dismissing it and denying it. So something's going on out there. There's no question about that. Are they craft from other planets, other worlds? Are they interdimensional creatures of some kind that have always been here, that live alongside us, and we've just never known it? I can't answer that, but I don't think demons is what they are. I've had experiences in my life. I've talked about it, on my own show a few times. And I've had the classic alien abduction encounter. It didn't go all the way to being taken up to the ship, but I did have the grays with the big eyes looking over me one morning, actually several mornings, when it was still dark. And I'd wake up and I just had this strange feeling. I couldn't move. I couldn't wake up my wife. And I looked up and there was this two grays looking down at me.
Up when you tell the story.
What was that? Sorry?
It starts to play up when you start telling your story about things like this. It's starting to come in and out.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. The thing is with aliens, and what I find interesting about aliens is that there are people that have had experiences with things that they call alien that are positive. They've been very good experiences with them. They're taught mysteries of the universe, and they come back with knowledge that they feel that they have to share. And then there's those that it takes a dark turn. Like, do you all remember Heaven's Gate? You had the Hale-Bopp comet, right? And they believed that there was a UFO behind that comet that they were going to take them to this utopian planet. But in order to do that, you had to release the physical body. So they all committed mass suicide so that they could be caught up by the UFO and taken to this new planet. That's when it becomes problematic, when you start having those kinds of, I mean, I guess we can't really say for sure it was a delusion, because for all we know, it actually worked. We don't know. Maybe they did end up on another planet. We can't prove it. Would I have done it? No, I wouldn't have done it. But, they certainly believed it, right? But then you got people that have the alien abduction where they're getting probed and they're having these very aggressive, intrusive procedures done that scares the hell out of them. So, it can go either way. I don't know what it is, but demonic does not seem to behave that way. Is there a connection with spirituality with these things? Yes. And that's, I think, where these churches are sort of not sure where the line gets blurred, because they're just not sure what it is. There is a spiritual dimension to it. So maybe it's just the simple fact that if these are more evolved creatures than we are, then it would stand to reason that their spiritualities would be more evolved. And I guess you could use that against other people as well as you could use it to help them.
And you said that this wouldn't end up with a UFO discussion, Chris.
I see that gray back there. Yeah, you got the gray and the ghost on either side.
I've actually got a question, and it's something that me and Drew were working on. Which was your idea with like poltergeist cases? Because we've been doing a lot of like shows lately on poltergeist cases, and how there's always a young girl involved. How it's always like it seems to be like a young girl that's always involved, and then all of a sudden, maybe a year or two later, it just disappears.
Yeah. I think I honestly think most poltergeist is just a telekinetic response to the emotional changes that take place, or the hormonal changes that take place in adolescence, particularly with females. For some reason, they seem to have a stronger telekinetic response than males do, and maybe it's the difference in hormones that are at play. Estrogen's going to have a different response, perhaps spiritually or energetically, than testosterone would. But it does seem to be mostly telekinetic. I've not found too many poltergeist cases that were indicative of some kind of intelligence there. It just seemed like energy moving around. And there was nothing else, just energy. And that sounds very telekinetic to me. And it might be that, this is a speculation on my part. I'm getting a little ahead of the world, I think, on this thought. And I could be completely wrong. I'm willing to accept that. But I think that our evolution is far from over. And I think that the hormonal development that we experience as human beings is part of our evolutionary experience. So I think that as we become more sophisticated on the path of evolution, these hormones slowly change us. And I do think that once we reach whatever the end goal is, let's call it Homo completenda, as a old colleague of mine used to refer to it as, we're Homo sapien now, but Homo completenda, the completed man, would have a power that would be largely incorporeal in nature, and perhaps the ability to speak telepathically or be able to move things with one's mind. I think that is fully within the range of possibility. We're just not quite at that point of our evolution where we would be able to explore it. But every now and then there might be a little anomaly that happens as the evolutionary process is unfolding. And you would experience that through the development of adolescence, when you're physically changing, which is all what evolution is here to do.
Also, as well, there
Drew,
was
would you like to ask
a
a
lot of
question?
the cases to do with the poltergeist. There was a lot of coal involved. There was coal fires and things like that. So we wondered if maybe that had a relevance to why these things were happening as well, because earth, air, fire, and water and things is like the perfect storm for a haunting. So was that connected away back in the 70s?
I think it can be, because I think anything that would leave an imprint on the energy of a particular location is going to create a vulnerability there, just like with people. So, we can become vulnerable by having all sorts, like an illness, physical illness or a mental illness, or we can become vulnerable by, like I said, being apathetic to our relationship to ourselves spiritually and God. But environment can do that too. The environment has a certain sentience to it as well, and it has an incorporeal nature, just like we do. So places have a spirit, just like people have a spirit, just like animals have a spirit. And that spirit can become vulnerable if things happen there that would attract a particular kind of energy. So yeah, you could have a perfect storm. You could have two or three completely unrelated paranormal things happening that all combine into this massive haunting, and you're like, what's going on here? When it really is, you might have a person with a extreme psychic vulnerability moving into a house that has a energetic vulnerability, and then somebody that comes in with an attachment moves in, and now you get three different unrelated problems all combining into one massive issue, and then you'd have to deal with each one of those independently. That can be a challenging case if you ever encounter that.
I do feel that's the case in a few of these locations. I think that's what's happened.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
So, Dakota, would you like to ask a question? Is it about aliens again?
No. I was just saying. I did notice that a couple questions that people are trying to bring up. Let's see. We'll bring it up here. Let's see. Dobby asks, "Do you need to go through any legalities and permissions before you can perform an exorcism?"
Not in the United States of America. Here in the U.S., it's fairly protected as a part of, I guess, the separation of church and state in a way. And that's even further reinforced financially, because if a church gets 501c3 status, it kind of is the federal determination that they are nonprofit. There's a special determination that the Internal Revenue Service grants us that means we can be non-reporting, which further creates a separation between the government's involvement in our organization's functioning, which of course is very good for churches because, personally, I'm a libertarian person, so I don't like the government being involved in anything I do. So if the church can operate without having to deal with the government watching over every single thing, that's always a good thing. But it also extends to the rights of the church. So exorcism is a protected religious right in the same way that there would be no need for some kind of legal permission to perform baptism or a legal permission to, receive the Eucharist. The only exception here is like with marriage, but even matrimony, unless the person, and usually they do, wants a legal marriage, I can still sacramentally marry anybody. If they don't care about the legal status of it and they don't want the tax breaks that come with being married in the U.S., I can perform that without the government having to be involved in it. But they're not going to have any legal recognition. But exorcism's kind of like that. So here, there's nothing that you would need to do. It's considered a religious right, and that you're autonomous in that respect, which we are grateful for. I don't know about you, Bishop Bryan, and I know Dakota's sitting next to me. I don't know about you, Drew, but there's been weird voices I've been hearing tonight. Have you been hearing them, Dakota? Mm-hmm. It's weird. It's every now and again I'll get it's like someone whispering into my ear. You have to go back and listen to the recording for EVPs.
Yes.
Never fails.
Yes.
Mystical was
So-
talking about the house
It-
that
it-
was beside her.
it
If you
never
want to
does
ask
feel-
that question. Sorry, Chris.
Where's that one, Dakota?
I'm looking for
the house next
it.
door.
Yeah.
Can bring it up. Chance disappeared from me.
It's on the screen, Chris.
Question: would you call this? What's that question? Would you call this a demon or demonic entity that causes people to die or kill themselves in a house every time there is a new tenant? That's actually really interesting. That.
Yeah, I
So
mean
every
that
time someone moves into this house,
there's a suicide or some kind of death. Death is usually, anytime. Well, I mean, death is ultimately the ultimate demonic experience, isn't it? Because when you look at the theology of the Christian faith, death came into the world because of sin. It was never supposed to be here. We were supposed to be eternal. But death was introduced to our nature when sin became part of it. And so you could say that death is the ultimate culmination of demonic activity because it's the ultimate culmination of going against creation, which was supposed to be an eternal experience. So yeah, I take very seriously when I see a strange deaths or reoccurring deaths in a particular location or associated with a particular location. That is usually the sign of something demonic going on there. However, it doesn't necessarily still mean it's satanic in a fallen angel sense. It can be, like I said, thought forms can do this too. Think about it. Again, get back to my example. You have a child, been abused all their life. They have this trauma. They project it out into a thought form without trying to. It just happens. Now they get this attachment. They think it's a demon that's coming after them. Can't get rid of it because it's built into their trauma and they don't realize it. So it's a way of this trauma always traumatizing them into their adulthood, to the point that what does that trauma want to do? It wants it to end. And the only way to end the trauma is to end the life. So you have this sentient thought form created by the victim out of their own trauma, trying to end their life so that the trauma ends. So this is just one example, but that's one way in which it can happen. It's still evil, but it's not satanic. So I would say that's demonic. If people are dying, that's never
There's
never
two portals
good
in
thing.
the house as well.
Oh, really? Okay. So there's vulnerability. See, when people talk about portals, I don't see them as like windows where things pass back and forth. I see them as weaknesses in the fabric of the corporeal world, where the incorporeal can engage more effectively through those times. There's places that are naturally predisposed to this. I would say that the entire city of Jerusalem is a portal. That is the energy is just way too strong there. But there's places here in the U.S., Native American sites and other locations where there was a lot of spiritual practice.
Egypt then.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Egypt for sure. Yeah, I think so. Although I think that Egypt it's waning now because there hasn't been. It's been so long since any of that was utilized in any kind of way. It's being developed now. I think the energy is living on in the impressions that all of us have of this marvelous location from history. We keep it alive because it's so mysterious. And what were those pyramids really for? How old are they? Every time I read about them, it seems like they're another 10,000 years. Where like there's some people that are now saying that they could be as old as 30,000 years. Which is crazy to me, but it lets the imagination run wild, and that creates spiritual energy too.
Definitely.
So, Bishop Bryan, could you please tell everybody where they can find you and where they can find your podcast? I've put some links to your YouTube channel into the chat. Can you point out all your locations? please.
Well, I appreciate that. And as it is there on the screen there, yep, at Nicholean, Nicholean, Lean, sorry. Or just look up Nicholean TV on YouTube. That's our YouTube channel. And you can find everything we do there. It's all on that one space. So the Mass, if you're interested in that, if you want to be part of the online religious community, you can watch everything we do there. If you're more into the paranormal and esotericism, you can watch Vestiges After Dark. Those are the services that the church provides. Vestiges is the teaching service, and the church is the pastoral service. If you need spiritual help, you can contact us through our website at esotericcatholic.org. Just click on request an investigation. I do have to say, though, that we have probably close to 7 or 8 cases coming in a week, and we can only take about 1 case a month. So you can just see how it's really like we try to triage it. We try to look and see who needs the most help and take cases that are more severe. And then, of course, there's always cases where they fill it out and then they regret doing so, and then they don't want the help after a while. So, I mean, it just happens. But, if you feel like you have a case and you need help, sometimes we can help you over the phone or with email too. We can kind of give you instruction as to what to do. But ultimately, you don't really need an exorcist as much as you need God. So I always tell people, get a relationship with God, and everything else seems to take care of itself after that.
Definitely, guys.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I would like to thank everybody that came to the show tonight. I would like to thank everybody that came, and thank you so much to my co-host Drew and my co-host Dakota tonight. And I would like to thank you, Bishop Bryan, for coming on. I really appreciate it. And we'll need to get you back sometime to do like a follow-up, kind of maybe like another show or something like that. And
Sure.
I would just like to catch you all later, ladies and gentlemen. And Bishop Bryan, thank you again. We'll talk to you behind the scenes once I end this. And everybody, catch you later, dudes. Have a great
Bye,
night.
guys.
Thank you for joining us on this exciting adventure with Ghost Squad Scotland. Our team of experienced ghost hunters use the latest technology to explore the paranormal and uncover the truth about the unknown. Don't forget that we're affiliated with Spirit Shack, the UK's premier ghost hunting equipment store, so you can trust our equipment to be top-notch. Plus, we have exclusive Ghost Squad Scotland merch available on our Zazzle store, so you can show your support for the team in style. And if you can't get enough of our ghost hunting adventures, be sure to tune into the Bald and Bonkers TV network to catch our show in action. Content creators can even have their own content syndicated on the network, or create their own custom online TV channel by visiting baldandbonkers.net. Thank you for your support. And remember to always keep an open mind as we continue to explore the mystery